Good evening. I am Mark Hughes with the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance, and welcome to Juxtaposition. We're here for the first time starting this back up after the pandemic. We want to, well, we shouldn't say after the pandemic, but we're here. I have a special guest here with me, Debbie Ingram from Vermont Interfaith Action, just sharing a brief blurb with you about what we're doing here at Vermont Racial Justice Alliance to secure sustainable power, ensure agency, provide security for American descendants of slavery while embracing their history and preserving their culture. That's what we do. We're doing that through a lot of ways, and we're going to be bringing some of that to you. So welcome again. This is Juxtaposition. This is a program about issues affecting black folks and black folks effecting change in our community. So welcome. Tonight, this afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit about the constitutional amendment. Again, like I said, I have Debbie here. Debbie, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for asking me.
It was like a last minute thing.
I'm always ready to jump on and talk with you.
I believe that. You always are. As a matter of fact, just starting the conversation out, I know you were a freshman senator in 2017.
That's right.
And I'm proud to say that you were the one who sponsored the constitutional amendment, the first constitutional amendment in over 240 years to effect change to address slavery in our Constitution. You want to talk just a little bit about that before we get started, about your experience with the Senate and how that played out?
Sure. Yeah. Well, yes, it was because of you, though, because we were at a debate, and I was a candidate for the Senate, as you said, and you asked all of us if we knew that the Constitution that we swore an oath to actually had exceptions for slavery, actually allowed slavery in Vermont.
I did.
And we were all sort of our mouths kind of dropped, and we all kind of stammered around answering it. But I do believe that I was the only one who said, well, if I get elected, I'm going to do something about that.
You were the only one. You were the only one.
And
I'm not going to out anybody.
No,
Senator Sorokin, Senator Ash, Senator, I'll call them all out. This is all Chittenden County, but it was that's what started it. And I think it was in 2016 leading up to the am I right? 2016 leading up to the election?
That's right, yeah. That was the election year. That's right, yep.
Okay, and then what happened?
And then what, right. Well, you can only introduce amendments to the Constitution every 4 years, so we had to do that in 2019, right? And so then I worked with you, and you gave me some ideas for what the language should be, how it should be changed. And we got a lot of sponsors, actually, to the senator's credit, to that proposition. But then it began quite a long process to work with the Committee of Jurisdiction, which was the Committee on Government Operations, and to really hone that language and make some persuasive arguments, because not everybody was automatically on board by any means. So finally it got through the committee, and then it got onto the floor, and I had that was quite an interesting day when we debated it on the floor. But we got across the finish line.
She's going to step around that conversation. Right? You're not going to talk about when you dressed the senator down. Okay. So well, this sister here was basically. Well, I'm not going to go into it, but it was a good conversation. So you'll have to go look it up yourself. So yeah, well, it was interesting. The whole process was interesting, and it was frustrating because we sought to amend the Constitution in a certain manner. We wanted to bring language in, the language that we thought was appropriate. We wanted to use, because often when we're changing, when we're writing policy at the statewide level, we always have an intent. Like a legislative intent, and then there's legislative research and so forth. And there was language that we were trying to connect it to systemic racism. We were also trying to connect it from an intent perspective to the 13th Amendment, but we didn't really have as much success with that as we would have liked to. Do you think that has contributed to the, maybe the lack of attention that's on this, and maybe the disassociation that many people have when we're talking about this in different places?
Yeah, I do think that a lot of Vermonters don't really get the whole context of what we're trying to do here, and definitely some of the legislators themselves, many of them, didn't see the connection between our legacy of slavery and the systemic racism that exists today, and so they couldn't make that connection. And then some weren't even aware of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution and the exception for punishment of a crime, which has been enshrined in our own federal Constitution since 1865. So yeah, they did. I mean, I'm just going to say, I'm a white person, and lots of white people, I know I've been on a journey to understand better the fact that people of color have had a very different experience of the United States of America than I have as a privileged white person. And I think that white people of goodwill are trying to educate themselves and trying to understand better, but it's a journey, and it's a step-by-step process. And, at least in Vermont, we have the ability to talk to one another, but sometimes we also have to kind of light a fire under one another.
It's necessary sometimes.
Yeah, so it's finding that right balance, and I'm glad that eventually it came around so that all but one senator voted in favor of it.
Yeah, but there's such an education involved in this.
Absolutely.
And I know that, it's almost like folks, just as it is, almost have to be incentivized just to learn something these days. And as I said, there is a downstream connection to our Constitution as it pertains to our statutes, as it pertains to our rules, our institutions, so on and so forth. And because what we know is that, if there's this thing called, and then here's another term, and here's another, class one must take, is this thing called systemic racism, and everybody's, oh boy, here's another one, because now we have to unpack that and define what that is. If that's the case, then by its definition, which we'll maybe spend a little time in a minute on, by its definition, what it actually suggests is that, of course, there are disparities that exist across all systems of state government, or all of these determinants. So when we look at the numbers, like if you look on our website, you'll see that we reflect how housing and education and employment and health services access, economic development, and so forth, that there are adverse disparate outcomes. Not by accident. It's not like Lemony Snicket's or something like that. So, oh my God, I can't understand why every single time black people, maybe they're just not as smart as us. Maybe they're just unlucky. Because So the truth is when we start to look at all of these numbers side by side, and when we start to look at our history as a nation, then we're able to put those two things together and understand that there is a legacy of slavery.
Absolutely.
So I think that, on one count, there may be a lot of folks that still struggle with that alone, because when one says slavery, one has to embrace what slavery may have meant in 1777, no matter whether it was for the conviction of whether it was for debts, fines, or the like, or whether it was a person's own will, or whether it was, because they're under the age of 21, which are the three exception clauses that exist in our Constitution. But still, making that connection, I think white people have difficulty with that.
It's very true. Yes. Yeah. Well, absolutely. I mean, it shouldn't be that hard, but because any time we develop an institution like slavery, human beings develop this institution. The idea basically is that some people are completely dehumanized. We're saying it's okay for some people to own other people, and of course, that mindset, and the culture that gets built around it, will then bleed into every possible institution. You can't just say because we fought the Civil War and some a few laws were changed that everybody's thinking automatically changed. And in fact, what happened after the Civil War when Reconstruction started, there were some good ideas, but very, very quickly, the Supreme Court basically invalidated both the 13th and the 14th Amendments. That it opened up the way for black codes, which imprisoned black people for petty crimes that white people wouldn't have even been cited for, much less imprisoned for. And that opened the way in turn to Jim Crow laws, or segregation in every walk of life,
leasing,
right? And then now we have what has been termed the new Jim Crow, which is drug wars, where black men especially are imprisoned at much higher rates than white people, and just on and on and on. And our the way that we developed our suburbs.
Debbie,
and
do white people like you?
Yeah. Lots of white people do like me. It's yeah. Sometimes I get a few sidelong glances, but no.
It certainly sounds like you've done your homework, and I think it's exceptional.
Well, thank you.
You've gone and you've done the work, that you're doing the work, and because these are not only are these not easy conversations. In fact, they're difficult conversations, but it also it takes a lot. It takes effort and time to go in and unpack all of this. We're talking about education. So we're dealing with so many different things. We've got so many moving parts. Here we've got our Constitution, which we haven't even covered yet. So we haven't even talked about what we're trying to resolve. Here's the proposal that actually fixes that. Here's a definition of systemic racism over here. So there's so much that feeds into that. And there's a slide later on the 13th Amendment, which our folks at the Abolish Slavery National Network, our national partners, one of our national partners, the numbers from them, they say that only 22% of America realize that there is a clause in the 13th Amendment that still has allowed slavery since 1865. So for the last 157 years, there's been a clause in the Constitution that says that slavery is permitted, and most folks in the United States don't seem to know about it.
Yeah, I know that is true. Well, I do want to put in a plug for the white people that in the congregations where I've been doing these presentations. And there are a lot of there are a lot of white people I think who are finally sadly the horrible tragedy of George Floyd and so many other black people being killed. And then the Black Lives Matter movement has stirred up a lot of white people to understand things better.
Right.
And they are, and many people besides me are trying to educate ourselves and trying to take that journey, as I was talking about before, and understand better. But yeah, it's so true that there's still a lack of awareness. And, we've been taught, the things we were taught in our schools, Vermonters were taught that Vermont was the first state to abolish slavery, when now we know that's not true.
Yeah, people don't like to hear that.
They don't like to hear that, I know. But it's, the fact that, there's the 13th Amendment has an exception in it. People weren't taught that in school.
I got a lot of hate mail for that one.
Yeah.
The whole, we weren't the first state to abolish. I mean, but it's true.
It is true.
It's the truth. And the truth is, in fact, that in 1777, and this, and listeners would really do well to kind of tune in on some of this stuff, is because before 1777, when in Windsor our state constitution was written, there was never a constitution, any state's constitution, that contained any language about slavery whatsoever. So when our Constitution was written in 1777, we wouldn't go on to be a part of the Union until 91, but understand that 10 years later, in 87 was when the United States Constitution was written. There were also 3 or 4 other states that wrote constitutions. In the Northwest Territory wrote a constitutional document as well. They would emulate Vermont. So they would go on to create exception clauses because Vermont was the trailblazer. We are the what we call the granddaddy of all exception clauses. There's never been an exception clause in any foundational document before Vermont. And that's something really super duper to process, because when you start thinking about that, what that means is we actually established something.
Right.
Really important to think about. And as we start to think about the fact that it was an exception clause in the 13th Amendment that really led to Jim Crow.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
It really, through convict leasing and sharecropping, it led to Jim Crow. We start to see this legacy. I think the other thing is that we don't understand about, how this stuff connects is obviously poverty.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
Because obviously pornographic levels of wealth were handed down generationally, but benefactors of poverty were largely black people, and then of course later there would be the creation of, the exacerbation of poverty in our white rural communities as well. So I think there's so much to learn here. How are we going to do it? How are we going to get folks to the ballots to understand, folks are going to look at this and they're going to be like, this is either a joke or else I'm just going to vote no because I don't know what it means. So what's the strategy? Yeah,
well, let's partner together, Mark. How's that? And use grassroots organizing methodologies.
Okay.
No, that's what we've been talking about now for quite a while, right? So, that's the basis of Vermont Interfaith Action's methodology on lots of issues. But we're working together to reach across the entire state. VIA's been doing presentations, congregation by congregation, to explain some of this, to do some of this education. And then we've used those to start recruiting volunteers who are going to be involved in a campaign that is going to have people writing letters to the editor, to calling up the people, having personal conversations with their friends and their neighbors and their coworkers, doing phone banking, doing all kinds of things like any kind of campaign. But we're really building a network of people all across the state, just ordinary, regular Vermonters who are people of goodwill, who are willing to be educated on this and who want to understand and to really support something that is very meaningful and very important.
Yeah, we're happy to be partnered with Vermont Interfaith Action and the Faith in Action at the national level with our partners as well at the Abolish Slavery National Network. We know you guys probably represent, about maybe 16,000 folks across the state, maybe 70 congregations.
That is right.
Mistaken. Did I get that right?
You got that right.
I did my homework.
Yes, you did.
So, there's that. And I think for folks who are watching, it's so important, when we start thinking about, what we're doing here, is when we start talking about this whole idea of eradicating systemic racism, is to make sure you get the opportunity to take a look at our website and maybe come out because we're also doing some stuff on every Thursdays, check and come out and hang out with us. I know you guys are there as well. Here's what the Constitution says. I have to read it. It says that all persons are born equally free. I'm going to stop there for a minute. And the reason why we're going to do this, I think, is because this is where the education starts.
Right, yeah.
And taking this time for folks who are watching us live today, this is an opportunity for folks to say, hey, Proposal 2 on the ballot in November actually amends our Constitution, and it definitely removes language in our Constitution that suggests slavery, because it's right here. Here's what it says, folks. It says this, watch. It says that all persons are born equally free and independent and have certain natural, inherent, and unalienable rights, amongst which are enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Therefore, no person born in this country or brought from overseas ought to be holden by law to serve any person as a servant, slave, or apprentice after serving to the age of 21 years, unless bound by a person's own consent after arriving to such age or bound by law for payment of debts, damages, fines, costs, or the like. That's it. That's what it says. So it's there. It's right there. It's black and white. It's right here. It's in the Constitution. So that clears that up. So we can move forward from that. And I think there's another piece though, because if we're really, I know right now there's other things that are happening across the state, across the United States. The cannabis things. Because cannabis is a Schedule I drug, but we just rolled out a market. So we basically told the feds, we're going to do what we're going to do because our values are X, Y, Z. Well, our values concerning slavery in this state, that's what we're really trying to define in this what we would call a referendum.
Yes.
So the other thing we should share is the 13th Amendment. Can I give it to you? Can you read it?
Sure, I'd be happy to read it.
13th Amendment.
Yeah, it's shorter than the article in the Vermont Constitution. It says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction.
Thank you for that. You got the short one.
Yeah.
I should have read that one. So I think the point that we're making here, that I'm making here, is by amending our Constitution, and we should share the language that they have proposed the Constitution be amended to. The language just says that all persons are born equally free, independent, and have certain natural, inherent, and unalienable rights, amongst which are enjoying and defending life, liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Therefore, slavery and indentured servitude in any form are prohibited, period. So this is your constitutional amendment. So just to just put a really fine point on it, what we're actually doing is two things. What we're doing is number one, we're removing 3 exception clauses from our Constitution, which have had, to what extent we don't quite know yet, and we shouldn't mind answering the question like that when folks say, so what implications have this language had on our statutes, our rules, our laws, our institutions? We'll get there. We'll figure that out. And we are doing some of that. We're figuring some of that out. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with that. And I think, it's kind of like peeling an onion.
Right.
And so it just so happens to be we're at the 4th year. So now we can go back for another constitutional amendment. And we have one. We'll talk about that later. And there's also statutes. And I think maybe next week we could talk more about them. But yes, there are downstream implications by removing that language, because there are some things here in the state that we think may not necessarily stand constitutionally, because we know that the Constitution is the litmus test for all legislation being passed, and also the litmus test for any appeal that comes up through the courts challenging any law. So if the Constitution changes, then of course our nice judges would have to take that into account. The second thing that it does, which is super amazing, is that it negates the loophole in the 13th Amendment, which means no thank you, federal government.
Right.
We would prefer not to have slaves. So I'm wondering, with the work that you are doing, is that hard for folks to catch on to, or as we're getting around to the congregations and having the conversations with the clergies and organizing the communities? Is that something that we're having difficulty with?
Well, it's certainly a surprise to a lot of people. I mean, I kind of, when I do the presentation, I sort of stop and say, this language about except for payment of fines, damages, and costs. Does that remind you of any other kind of language? And very few people, there have only been 1 or 2 presentations out of, we've done about 15 of them, where somebody was able to say, oh yeah, that sounds like the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So, people are, again, we've just been taught that, oh yeah, no, 13th Amendment just, it ended slavery. And it's like, well,
what's the biggest challenge?
Actually read it.
What's the biggest challenge with folks? I mean, I'm just curious to hear what, because I've been, I was in training on Saturday with y'all, and I heard some great questions, and I was kind of like, I ain't saying nothing, right?
Right.
But what's some of the biggest challenges that you're seeing as you're as you're going around the state?
Well, just, people just don't know. They haven't been taught, and I think finally we're beginning to realize in this country that the things that we were told in the past aren't necessarily all true, not completely true. And but it's hard, right? It's hard for people if they've been taught something all their life that it's one way to go, oh my goodness, I got to switch gears here and change and go, wow, it doesn't say what I thought it said. And then, well, what does that mean? Then in the bigger picture, what does that mean? So that's where we are. It's a difficult place for folks to be.
And I think the other connection because this is stuff that people need to care about in order to stop and take the time to learn.
Yeah.
And when you start thinking about generational wealth,
Yep.
We were talking about restrictive deeds a little while ago back in the legislative session, and that's a whole nother show. But when you start thinking about, property ownership, there of black folks who own property in the city of Burlington. In the city of Burlington, 13 houses belong to black folk in the city of Burlington. So you've got to be able to stop and take a step back and say, there has to have been some kind of contiguous connection to this thing called slavery and things like slavery and badges and incidents surrounding slavery. But even if that weren't the case, just to be able to step back and say, okay, throw your hands up like we did on Saturday and say, do we want slaves or not? That's just a simple question.
Right.
Do we want to be a state? Do we want to own slaves or not? As a person right now, as tax-paying folks in the state of Vermont, do we want to walk around saying we own slaves, right?
Yeah, right.
So
or that it's okay to own for one person to own another person.
Right. Is it cool? Is it cool for
obviously?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
We hope everyone will say obviously not.
But some people won't.
Yeah, it's true.
And I think that's really what we have to come to terms with too. Is to find our people.
Yeah.
Find our people. And that's fine. Of course, you need to talk to your uncle, the guy who's sitting at the table, that person you never want to talk to. Find our people. Debbie, thank you so much.
It's been great.
You are amazing. I'm so glad you came out. I want to, before we close out, I will share a little bit about, we're having fun at the Richard Kemp Center, and I want to talk a little bit about that and invite you out to come down and join us. Because we're doing some things, we're shooting some things. For those of you who don't know what the Richard Kemp Center is again, as some of these challenges manifest themselves in our neighborhoods, we know systemic racism, the legacy of slavery, it has created significant wealth disparities and cultural disempowerment amongst black Vermonters. One way in which this manifests itself is, as I just told you a little while ago, is the housing ownership here in the city of Burlington. We know that adverse racial disparities, they exist across all of these social determinants, as we said earlier. And these disparities, in addition to cultural erasure and appropriation, directly and indirectly affect the health and the wellness of black folks and individuals and communities around here. And it also, watch this, it also threatens economic development, democracy, and even social health and the wellness of all Vermonters. So what we're doing here in Burlington is we're centering the needs of the black community in the work of rectifying historical racial inequities. We're accomplishing this work by serving as cultural brokers in the city of Burlington in the expansion of the programs and the services to these marginalized communities where they have historically been ineffective. In a lot of cases, they've been inefficient and sometimes even non-existent. And so we're creating new systems that empower black Vermonters denied equal access to public or private economic and other opportunities. And we're creating space in Burlington where black communities, wellness and culture and youth, they all intersect. So I just needed to get that plug in. That was my responsibility. I had to say that to y'all before we got off of here. Again, Debbie, thank you so much for being with us. Stop in and hang out with us at the Kemp Center. Thank you for the work that the Vermont Interfaith Action is doing. And thank you for taking this thing to the ballot with us. Together we're gonna win.
We are. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks again. And thank you all for coming as well. We'll see you next time. Here we are, Juxtaposition, the Racial Justice Alliance. We're glad to have you. Good night.